The town of Dry Creek sat like a forgotten coin in the dust, its main street lined with leaning buildings and faces hardened by years of struggle. The war had taken men, the fire had taken homes, and drought had taken hope. Folks spoke less, worked harder, and prayed only when they remembered how. Yet on the edge of that hollowed town lived Ethan Cole, a man whose silence spoke louder than any sermon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the kind of weariness that wasn't just in his bones but deep in his soul. People respected him, feared him a little too, but no one dared to ask about the emptiness in his eyes. He had once been a different man, young, laughing, quick with a smile, but time and tragedy had carved him down to something quieter, someone who kept his heart behind locked doors. Ethan lived alone in a cabin set on the ridge, the kind of place that looked out across the valley as if keeping watch over the broken town below. His days were spent mending fences, working cattle, and fighting the kind of loneliness that made a man's chest feel like stone. Nights were worse. He'd sit by the fire, staring at the flames, listening to the silence as if it might finally tell him why he had survived when so many others hadn't. Sleep rarely came easy, and when it did, it brought dreams he would rather forget. Down in town, Clara Whitmore was learning the weight of starting over. She had stepped off the stagecoach weeks before with nothing but a threadbare satchel, her savings tucked inside a hidden pocket, and a determination born of desperation. Her father had been a preacher, a man who believed in truth and sacrifice, but she had buried him young, and life had given her no soft path. Once, she had believed in love. Once, she had believed a man's promise meant forever. But the day sickness struck her, leaving her frail and weak, her fiancé had turned his back, casting her aside like she was a burden too heavy to bear. Betrayal left her hollow, and shame drove her far from the town where whispers followed her every step. Dry Creek was not much, but it was far enough from her past to be a chance at something new. Clara rented a room above the Mercantile, its walls thin and its roof patched more with hope than wood. She found work stitching dresses, hemming trousers, and mending coats for the townsfolk. Her hands were skilled, her stitches fine, yet she earned little more than pennies. Women came and stood by her corner, measuring themselves in the mirror while sneaking glances at her, whispering behind gloved hands. Men offered kind smiles, some too bold, but she kept her eyes low and her words soft. She had learned that standing out only invited cruelty. Every night, after her lamp flickered out, Clara lay in her narrow bed and prayed. She prayed for strength, for purpose, for some reason to believe the world had not entirely forgotten her. Sometimes she wondered if God had left Dry Creek long ago, but she whispered into the dark anyway, because the act of praying was all she had left to keep her heart from breaking. It was on a night heavy with rain that her path crossed Ethan's. The storm had begun at dusk, a low rumble rolling over the valley until the sky opened and poured down with merciless force. Clara had climbed to the roof with a hammer and scrap of wood, determined to patch the leaks that had spread like veins across her ceiling. But the boards were too weak, the storm too strong, and before she knew it, her roof gave way, sending water cascading into her small room. The bed was soaked, her trunk drenched, and the little comfort she had carved out for herself was ruined in minutes. Cold and desperate, she gathered what she could into her satchel, clutching it to her chest as the rain beat down. She stumbled through the mud, her dress plastered to her skin, her shoes sinking into the earth. Lights flickered in some windows, but no one came to help. No one offered her shelter. She stood in the street for a long moment, trembling, her hair dripping into her eyes, before she saw the faint glow on the hill, the steady, unwavering light from Ethan Cole's cabin. Her breath caught, half in fear, half in hope. She didn't know him well, she had only seen him ride into town on occasion, buying supplies with little more than a nod and a grunt. He was the kind of man others kept their distance from. But in that moment, Clara had no other choice. She pulled her shawl tighter and began the climb up the ridge, every step heavier than the last. By the time she reached the porch, she was shaking so badly she could hardly lift her hand to knock. The door swung open with a groan, and Ethan stood there, firelight casting shadows across his face. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her, rain-soaked and pale, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. For a long second, neither moved. He was a man who had built walls high enough that no one dared cross them, and she was a woman too tired to keep pretending she was strong. When her knees buckled and she nearly collapsed, he caught her without thinking, his arms firm around her slight frame. "Come in," he said at last, his voice rough, gravelly from disuse. Clara stepped into the cabin, the warmth hitting her like a wave. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with the scent of burning pine. Ethan led her to a chair by the fire, fetched a blanket, and wrapped it around her shoulders without meeting her eyes. She clutched it gratefully, feeling the heat seep into her bones, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. He poured her a mug of coffee, the steam curling upward, and set it before her. Then he sat across the room, leaning against the table, his arms crossed, watching her like a man who didn't trust what he was seeing. "Why'd you come here?" he asked after a silence that stretched too long. Her fingers tightened around the mug, the warmth anchoring her. She lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze for the first time, and spoke with a honesty she didn't even mean to bear. "Because I had nowhere else." The words hung in the air, stark and heavy. Something inside Ethan shifted, though he tried not to show it. He had said those very words once, years ago, when war had left him bleeding and lost. He understood more than he wanted to admit. That night, he offered her the cot in the corner, his voice gruff as he told her she could stay until the storm passed. Clara lay awake long after he had banked the fire, staring at the ceiling of a home that wasn't hers, listening to the steady breathing of a man who had let her in against his better judgment. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in months, she felt the faint flicker of safety. Ethan sat in the darkness, unable to sleep, listening to the quiet presence of another soul in his cabin. It unsettled him, it stirred something in him he thought had long since died, and he didn't know whether to fight it or let it grow. But as the storm raged outside, neither of them could deny that fate had already begun to weave its thread between them. Spring came slowly to Dry Creek that year, melting the snow in hesitant trickles and pushing green shoots through the stubborn ground. With it came a quiet change in Ethan's cabin. Clara had stayed longer than either of them intended. At first, it was necessity, her roof was gone, and she had no money to repair it. But days stretched into weeks, and she began to settle into the rhythm of Ethan's world. She swept the cabin each morning, hummed softly as she cooked simple meals, and stitched small patches into his shirts when she thought he wouldn't notice. The silence that had once weighed like a burden in the cabin seemed lighter with her presence, filled with the sound of her footsteps, her voice, and the occasional laughter she couldn't keep contained. Ethan fought against it, every instinct in him warned that letting her stay was dangerous. He had seen too much loss, and he had no business letting hope take root again. Yet each day he found himself looking forward to the sight of her bent over the hearth, her hair catching the glow of the firelight. He caught himself listening for her humming when he came in from the fields, and sometimes, when the night was especially quiet, he realized he was breathing easier simply because she was near. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Clara, too, felt the shifting current between them. At first, she had kept her distance, grateful for his kindness but wary of overstaying her welcome. Ethan was not an easy man to read, his eyes carried storms, his words were few, and his presence filled the room like a shadow she could not escape. But in the smallest moments, she caught glimpses of something softer. When he fixed her chair so it wouldn't wobble. When he set aside the choicest portion of meat for her without a word. When she dropped a spool of thread and he picked it up, holding it awkwardly in his large hands before placing it gently on the table. Those small kindnesses pierced her defenses, reminding her of things she thought she'd lost, the ache of being seen, the hope of being cared for. One evening, after a long day repairing a broken fence, Ethan came into the cabin covered in dust and sweat. Clara had been sewing by the window, the fading light catching the curve of her cheek. She looked up as he entered, her lips parting as though she might speak, but then she simply smiled instead. It was a small smile, hesitant but warm, and it struck him harder than a bullet. He turned away quickly, muttering about washing up, but her smile lingered in his mind long after he had scrubbed his hands at the basin. That night, they ate together at the small wooden table, the fire flickering low. Conversation came in broken pieces, but it came easier than before. Clara told him about her father, how he used to read scripture aloud in the evenings until his voice grew hoarse. Ethan shared, reluctantly, about the war, how he had marched with men who never came home, how the sound of gunfire still woke him some nights. Neither pressed too hard, yet each word carved away at the walls they had built around themselves. Later, as the wind rattled the shutters, Clara stood before the small mirror Ethan had nailed to the wall. Her dress was plain, patched in places, but she studied her reflection as if searching for the woman she once was. She lifted her hand to her cheek, tracing the lines of her face, and for a moment, she felt the faint stirrings of beauty, something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching without meaning to. His jaw tightened, his chest heavy with a feeling he had no name for. She turned suddenly, catching his gaze, and he felt caught like a boy stealing glances at a girl for the first time. He should have looked away, but he didn't. "You look," he began, the words thick in his throat. He forced them out, clumsy but true. "You look like sunlight." The words hung between them, fragile and startling. Clara's eyes widened, filling with tears. She tried to blink away. No one had spoken to her like that in so long, not without pity, not without some hidden intent. Her throat tightened, and when she finally found her voice, it came out as a whisper. "I don't know why God brought me here, Ethan. But I think it wasn't by accident." He wanted to deny it, to say it was coincidence, to tell her she was wrong. But he couldn't. Deep down, in the place he had locked away all hope, he knew she was right. He had prayed once, long ago, in the middle of a battlefield soaked in blood, that if God would give him a reason to keep living, he'd find a way to endure. Maybe, just maybe, Clara was that reason. The air thickened between them, heavy with something neither could name. Clara's hands trembled as she reached behind her, fumbling with the ties of her dress. Ethan's breath grew shallow, his entire body tense, torn between wanting to stop her and being unable to move. When the fabric loosened and slipped slightly from her shoulder, revealing the pale curve of skin marred by an old scar, he felt his heart seize. She wasn't offering herself in recklessness, she was showing him her brokenness, the part of her she thought would drive anyone away. She lifted her eyes to his, white and vulnerable, as if to say, "This is who I am. This is what I carry. Can you still look at me the same?" His hands shook, and he stepped forward, his fingers hovering in the air before brushing lightly against her shoulder. The scar was raised, jagged, the mark of battles she had fought in silence. His throat worked, and the only words that escaped him were a prayer, ragged and raw. "God help me." Clara flinched, not from his touch but from fear of rejection. Her breath caught, and she waited for him to turn away. But Ethan didn't. Instead, he dropped to his knees before her, his rough hands taking hers gently, reverently, as though she were something holy. His eyes burned, not with pity but with fierce honesty. "You don't have to hide from me," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not your scars, not your past, I've got my own. Maybe we can carry them together." The tears spilled down Clara's cheeks then, but they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of relief, of release, of being seen not as ruined but as whole. She let out a sob that broke into a laugh, and Ethan, startled, let out a shaky laugh of his own. The sound was strange, foreign to both of them, but it felt like light cutting through years of darkness. She leaned into him, her forehead against his, and for a long time, they stayed that way, breathing in the truth of what had just been spoken. There were no promises yet, no vows, but in that small cabin on the ridge, something sacred had taken root. When Ethan finally drew her into his arms, it was not with hunger but with reverence. He held her as though she were the answer to every battle he had fought, every prayer he had whispered in the dark. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight in his chest begin to lift. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world washed clean, and inside the cabin, two broken souls found the courage to begin again.